First of all, I just want to say welcome to Zoom Into Career. This is a series designed to introduce students to a culture of achievement by interviewing industry professionals. I'm Andrew Kohler, the Community Relations Coordinator here at Yelm Community Schools, and today we have Mike Walker with us to share a little bit about his career at Boeing. I'd like to remind you that this Zoom is recorded, and it'll be posted on our website for future viewing. Welcome, Mike, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And can you, to start off, can you tell us a little bit about what your position is and what you do for Boeing?
Right now, I lead a group called Initio Maintenance Training. And for those that don't understand what the term means, ab initio is a Latin term for from the beginning. So what we're developing is training curriculum to address the student who's entering into aviation training, specifically in maintenance, at the very beginning of their career. So if you consider here in Washington, we have five community colleges which teach what's referred to as an airframe and power plant program, where they can receive an FAA A&P license. That's a good example of ab initio training.
And what are a couple of those colleges off the top of your head?
Well, here on the west side of the mountains, we have Clover Park Technical College, South Seattle College, and Everett Community College. And in central Washington, we have Big Bend Community College in Moses Lake and Spokane Community College in Spokane.
And there's a lot of different careers in aviation, from pilots to mechanics to management. Where did you start, kind of going all the way back? And I think, were you Air Force?
Once upon a time.
And can you kind of explain what your journey was like?
Wow. It was a long journey, so I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. I started out as a mechanic. After 3 years, I became an electronics technician, which moved me from transport airplanes to strategic bombers and tankers. Very interesting platforms. And after another three and a half years, I cross-trained. I became a flight engineer, came back over here to McCord, and I flew C-141s for 14 years. And I can say with no reservations whatsoever, that was the best job I ever had. And when I retired from the Air Force, I had several FAA licenses that I obtained while I was in the military through self-study. I went to work for Alaska Airlines for a while as a mechanic. And then because I had a dispatcher's license, I went to work for another airline as a dispatcher, dispatching 737s out of Detroit until the company went out of business. And a few months later, I got a job with Boeing. That was about 20 years ago. And I started out at Boeing as a 737 instructor, teaching Boeing customers how 737s worked. I also then, after a while, learned the 777 airplane. And I took a brief tour in China. I spent 1.5 years in China, in Shanghai, building training programs in a joint venture there that Boeing had. Came back. I worked as a 787 instructor for a few years. I took over the regulatory office because much, if not most, of our training by then had become approved by various regulatory agencies around the world. Then I moved to business development, and when my business development office was dissolved, I was moved to ab initio training program development to lead that particular program. So that's where I'm at now. I've got teaching experience across a multitude of disciplines and airplanes. And it's kind of interesting. I'm towards the end of my career and I'm focusing on teaching beginning people. So I like to think of it at times as a way of contributing to an area that led me to a very long career in aviation.
And this might be a dumb question, so forgive me if it is. Who exactly do you train?
Well, in the group I'm in now, nobody specifically, because we're still developing the materials and we're investigating a lot of different kinds of pedagogy to employ in the development of this program. And we're also investigating a lot of technologies that we want to put in this program. But prior to this, when I was teaching the various airplanes, they were all Boeing customers who had purchased Boeing airplanes and needed to be taught how those airplanes functioned. And so that's the primary reason for my employment at Boeing until I took these other positions.
And I assume that's a lot of business to business relations.
Yes, and probably more interesting is international students, almost exclusively. We did have some American customers, you know, like United Airlines or an American Airlines as an example, or maybe the US military would have a military derivative of one of our airplanes. Most of the people we taught were our foreign customers. So it was a very, very interesting experience talking to people who were from other parts of the world, who had a different perspective, and at many times struggled with the English language. So we'd have to find ways to communicate, to be effective in our teaching. So I found that part of the job not only challenging, but probably my favorite part, because it made me earn my pay.
And is there anything that you could recommend students do now if they're interested at all in the aviation industry, course selection or colleges to look at, anything at all?
Well, right now is an interesting time in aviation, not just because of the coronavirus, but even prior to then, we were seeing a very large expansion in the aviation space. And the problem that we were all seeing was that we needed more pilots and technicians than we had. And the growth rate of pilots and technicians was behind the growth rate of the airline projections of growth. And so therefore we were facing an impending shortage of these folks. And so depending on what area you wanted to go into, I would say if you wanted to become a pilot, it's expensive, but the career is lucrative in the long term. And there are many, many possibilities for future employment as a pilot. And there are many airlines now that have programs where you can go to one of their identified preferred training providers, a private school as an example, and get your necessary qualifications and build the requisite amount of hours. And then you enter their pipeline, if you will, to begin your career as a regional pilot. And then after a few years, you would move up to the major airline. Similarly, there's a lot of demand for aviation maintenance. And in aviation maintenance, the cost of training is not nearly as high. It's much less expensive if you go to a 2-year community college. I would recommend, if you had aspirations someday of being one of the members of the leadership of an organization, that you combine your maintenance studies with a degree study so that you could begin your work as a mechanic, which nowadays pays very well, and then with your degree, take advantage of that education and move up into leadership positions as your experience in aviation grows. The demand for technicians far outstrips the available supply, I'm sorry to say. And so I think it will be something that will be in strong demand for quite some time.
And that's good to hear. When I was in school, they were talking about that pilot shortage that you just brought up. Did we end up seeing that the way they thought we would?
Well, let me answer it this way, because it's very hard to pinpoint any data that clearly spells out that there's a shortage, right? So I'll answer it this way, and I'll try and be as brief as I can. In the past, like when I was a young man 20, 30 years ago, if you wanted to become an airline pilot with the major carriers, you had to toil away at building up your hours, find some other jobs within a regional market or some other flying job to build up hours and experience, which would also allow you to progress and fly faster and more complex machines until you became a viable candidate for the airlines. Or you could go into the military and serve some time in the military and fly high performance aircraft, which would also help you to get employed by the major airlines. But in either case, it took quite a bit of time and it took quite a bit of work and experience. Today, in those programs that I'm talking to you about, or I mentioned a moment ago, young people, as soon as they get the minimum amount of hours, they're going on and they're getting a job and going to work for the regionals. And then as soon as they get enough time at the regionals, they can make the transition to the major airlines. So I think that's an indicator of how few pilots are available, if I could answer it that way.
Yeah. And do you have any recommendations on things to read or things to research? Any videos that you've found interesting?
Well, I don't know that I can point to any specific videos because I don't have a need to do this kind of thing. But what I would recommend to a young person who's maybe considering aviation, make sure you keep up on your math skills, especially if you want to be a pilot. Stay involved or get a good background in science. In particular, if you can, focus on things like climatology and basic physics, because all of that play factors into effectively flying an airplane. Even if you're going to be a mechanic, basic math is used all the time as a technician, whether it's fractions or measurements, or it's computing a shift in weight and balance of an airplane. Some of this is very basic algebra, and some of it is not as advanced as algebra, but more complex in terms of measurements and precise. And a fundamental understanding of physics is very important, because your work will be affected by the environment that you work in.
In talking about math, I automatically think problems. What is a recent problem or project that you had to work on, or a challenge that you had to overcome?
Using math?
Using math, or just in general. Speaking of math made me think of problems, and I thought maybe you've worked on a certain project recently that you found interesting, or a little nuance that you didn't see coming.
Wow. I get those issues fairly regularly. It's easier for me to relate when I flew because I would always have to solve problems every day. How much fuel do I need? How far can I get on it? What happens when I'm halfway there and I lose an engine? Where can I go? Is that runway long enough? Are the winds in the right direction? Is the weather going to be a factor? Those are just samples of the kinds of things that you have to solve on a daily basis if you're flying. As an instructional developer now, or a program developer, I have to solve problems that is my content meeting the appropriate level required by the regulatory agency is one example. how do I embed within my learning management system a link that allows me to use my HoloLens to deliver a lesson? How do I communicate this complex theory in a lesson format that will be understandable by someone where English is a second language? So these are the kind of problems I'm dealing with today. On the technology side, I rely heavily on the people that I work with who have an expertise in those areas. And then I, in turn, I've become an interpreter, if you will, of what they tell me versus what I need to convey to others as to how this fits, how this works, or how we can deploy it, or why it's valuable. Why do we need to do something this way? Because as the leader of this program, I spend a lot of time justifying the kind of things that we're doing.
And when you have an idea or kind of a proposal, how does that process work from the time that you think of it or you're trying to implement something? Does it touch a lot of hands, or how does it go from idea phase to final, this is the curriculum?
Well,
I don't know if that's the right question, but I hope maybe you can pick up and put it down.
I think I do. In my position, when an idea comes to me, one of the first things I like to do is socialize it with others within my group and seek their input and seek their rebuttal. Did you think about this? That won't work because, or that's a great idea. Maybe we could marry it to something we're already doing. That expands the scope of the idea. And it also helps me fine tune the idea. At the same time, in the back of my mind, the business development guy is thinking, okay, what's this going to cost me to build this? What sort of return on investment can I realize? How long does it take for me to get an ROI on the amount of money I'm going to spend to build this? So then I can start to develop a business case on an idea about why we should go forward with this particular project. And then in the end, ultimately, it has to fit into the curriculum seamlessly. It has to make sense. And I want it to be especially effective at conveying thoughts and concepts to the recipient or the student. I'm very fortunate. I work with a good group of people who are willing to share ideas and input. And I am very fortunate to have leadership that are willing to entertain a lot of crazy ideas from Mike Walker and have patience with me when I come up with some things that they think is just a little bit too crazy.
So it sounds like you almost have to be a little bit humble and not get too attached to your initial thoughts and taking that input and communicating with others. So it's really kind of a collaborative effort.
If you aren't humble, you will learn humility quickly. Because we deal with a lot of experts who are not afraid of demonstrating their expertise and explaining to you any shortcomings in your ideas. But I welcome that. It comes, at least in me, it comes from my flying days when I had to work with other crew members. And if you were thin-skinned, you were not going to do very well. And so in my particular situation, sometimes I get an idea, and I have a sense of ownership of that idea, and I really want to see it through. And then I know the minute I let it go, it's no longer sole propriety of mine, and I know I'm gonna take dings. And I am always going to be surprised if I don't, because then maybe I didn't explain myself well enough for people to have counter opinions about what I said. So yeah, you can't be thin-skinned. You have to be willing to work with others, and you have to be receptive to external input, and be willing to hear information and see information and say, maybe I didn't think about this, or actually, I think that might be better than what I thought. Things like that. You have to be willing to do that, especially when you have to collaborate with so many people to make a project come to fruition, because nobody does this by themselves.
And that's really, I was going to ask you, what advice would you give to a graduating senior? But I'd like to flip that a little bit. And if you had any advice to give to yourself as a graduating, 18-year-old class of 2020, so to speak, what would you have told yourself, or what advice would you have given yourself?
When you live as long as I do or have, you think about that once in a while. I would have told myself, you're not as good as you think you are. I would have told myself, you're not as smart as you think you are, but you have a lot of capability. So take the time to learn the things that you need to learn them well, and do them to the best of your ability. Because really, you should never settle for anything less than the best of your ability. And ultimately, follow your heart, because your heart will point you in the right direction. Because I don't care what it is that you do. If your heart is not in it, and you don't believe in it, and you don't enjoy it, you won't do it very long, and you probably won't do it very well. And earlier I told you that I flew as a flight engineer for 14 years, and I said to you that it was the best job I ever had. And I mean that in the most earnest way that I can say it. I never loved a job more than that job. I never had a job before or since where I look forward to doing it, no matter what it was that they were asking me to do, as much as I enjoyed doing that job. And I will tell you, I did not get rich from doing it. I didn't put a lot of money in the bank. We were still tight financially, but I loved that job. And my life was very good then. Not that it's bad now, but it was very good then, because that part of my life was squared away. I enjoyed it. It was a challenge. It picked at all of the things that Mike Walker needed picking at, right? Use your brain, use your body, use your endurance, work with these people. It made me do all those things, and it did it very well for me. So I could focus when I came home on being a good father and a good husband, because everything else was already taken care of. So I would tell myself those things, looking back on my life, that, coming out of high school, you're not as bright as you think you are. You don't really have a grasp on the world like you think you do, but that's okay. That's okay. You're 17 years old. I don't expect it of you, but just kind of open your eyes and your mind a little bit more, and be more receptive to inputs from others.
And I think that what we talked about earlier, and taking input from multiple different people, and presenting an idea and getting that feedback, I think that's a great example of exactly what you just said. Of you don't know as much as you think you do, but you'll learn. And
Yeah.
as long as you stay flexible and ambitious, and continue to follow what your passions are, I think you sum that up very well.
No, thank you.
So yeah, in closing, is there anything else that we haven't talked about today that you would like to add?
With respect to aviation, or with respect to pursuing a career, what is it exactly?
Anything that, I guess we could go down. I like the advice road. I always kind of jump into that. Is there any other bits of advice that you would like to give maybe the class of 2020, or future future graduates as well, because this video will be up as a resource for years down the road.
I do a lot of research in my work. It's imperative. I have to know what my competition's doing. I have to know what's relevant within my industry, my workspace. I have to know where technology is going. I have to know a lot of different things so that I can help steer my efforts in the right direction. And what I'm trying to say there is that, again, going back to my flying days, one of the things that was always imparted on us is that a good crew member, a good flight engineer or pilot stays ahead of the airplane. And what that means is not only are you cognizant of what's happening to you at the moment, you are also cognizant of what you need to prepare for what's about to happen in front of you and what could happen an hour or 2 hours ahead of you, and have an idea of how you would deal with it. And that same principle applies to what I just said. Knowing what I did last week was good last week, but it may not apply today. And knowing where the future is going is a good thing to know, but it can help drive what I'm doing. But I have to be careful at the same time that I don't miss the target because I anticipated something that never came to be. And I'm saying this now because over the last few weeks, because of the virus, I've been doing a lot of research because of the training that we're developing of where I think the industry is going to be as we come out of it. I think we're going to see, just as we're probably starting to envision in your community now, how we teach people are going to change. The standard model of everyone sitting in a classroom with 30 other students, as an example, we might not get back to that. It's quite possible. I know that in aviation training, we are already starting to shift gears and prepare for the inevitability that we're going to be doing a lot more training online. We're going to be using a lot more virtual tools to facilitate that training. And we're going to be using competency as a tool of measurement versus test scores, because test scores are great. They serve a purpose, especially in the academic world. But as a technician or a pilot, we want you to demonstrate that you can actually do what it is that we expect you to do. So I see a lot of changes happening across a wide spectrum of disciplines, not just technical, not just aviation. How we go to the store, how we shop is going to change. How we get an education is going to change. So keep your eyes open would be another piece of advice. Do your research, develop your opinions based on what you've learned. Don't take a 30-second sound bite off the television and use that as gospel. And be open to new and different ideas. Because if you are, what you may have thought something before could be influenced by new data that you receive. But look to the future and anticipate so it doesn't catch you off guard.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Mike. I got to tell you, I really enjoyed this conversation today, and
thank you.
I think a lot of people that'll watch this video down the road will also feel the same way that I do. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and we really do appreciate your time.
You're welcome. And once again, thanks for asking me.